This week, the government took decisive and forceful actions to stabilize and strengthen public confidence in our financial system. I can reassure the members of the committee that our banking system is sound and that Americans can feel confident that their deposits will be there when they need them.
That was Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen testifying on Capitol Hill this week amid growing concerns about the economic impact of Silicon Valley Bank's failure. Joining us now is Senator Elizabeth Warren, a member of the Senate Banking Committee. Good morning, Senator Warren. Thank you for joining us. So,
good morning. Good to be with you.
Great to have you. You heard Secretary Yellen say that she has confidence that the banking system is sound, although this week we saw troubles with yet another bank, First Republic Bank, getting a $30 billion lifeline from some of the larger banks. Are you as confident as the Secretary that the banking system is sound?
Well, if I can, let me describe what I see as the problem. Starting back in 2016 or so, these multi-billion-dollar banks that, like SVB, in fact, Gary Becker, the CEO of SVB, came to Washington and kept saying, lighten the regulations on us. We're just like tiny little banks, so ease up on the regulations. Donald Trump then ran for president, promising he would ease up on the regulations on these multi-billion-dollar banks. He then was elected president, and he put in a lot of regulators who eased up on banking regulations. Trump then went to Congress, and he said, let's ease up even more, and with the help of both parties, passed laws to roll back on regulations and open the door to easing up even more. Then Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Fed, stepped up and took a flamethrower to the regulations, saying, I'm doing this because Congress let me do it. And what happened was exactly what we should have predicted. And that is the banks, these big multi-billion-dollar banks, loaded up on risk. They boosted their short-term profits. They gave themselves huge bonuses and big salaries, and they exploded their banks. And so where we stand now is now the federal government's got to step back in and back up these multi-billion-dollar banks. And I think there's two halves to this. One half is the government is clearly doing that, but there are a lot of people who are saying, gee, if they've been so lightly regulated for such a long period, it's important to look under the hood and see what's happening with the other banks.
So I want to ask you about that deregulatory push and your effort to try to get some of those regulations back in place. But first, over the weekend, have you had any conversations with the regulators about additional banks at risk of failing?
I'm not going to talk about private conversations, but I think, let me be clear about what I'm calling for right now. I'm calling for an independent investigation of the Fed and the whole regulatory system here. The Fed doesn't just get to do its own investigation. I'm calling for the Fed right now to reverse its weakened regulations and to bear down, to look at these banks with much more scrutiny. And then I'm also calling on Congress, as you rightly say, to roll back the ability of the Fed to weaken regulations and calling for these CEOs to be held accountable, so that we have laws in place to get clawbacks of their bonuses, of their giant salaries. And when you explode a bank, you ought to be banned from banking forever.
Do you think we could see criminal charges?
It depends. I think there will be investigations. Department of Justice has opened an investigation. I think that's appropriate for them to do. We'll see where the facts take them. But we got to take a close look at this. And look, we got to say overall that we can't keep repeating this approach of weakening the regulation over the banks, then stepping in when these giant banks get into trouble. You know, little community banks don't get this benefit. They got to run their shop every single day to make sure they are safe and sound. Their regulators bear down pretty hard on them. It's these giant multi-billion-dollar banks. There was such an irony that Gary Becker came to Washington and said, weaken the regulations because we're just like those tiny little banks that can't pose a risk to the overall economy.
But if I can ask you,
that's obviously not true.
If I can ask you, though, that deregulatory move in 2018 was supported by a number of your Democratic colleagues who still defend their votes. I mean, Senator Bennett said it was a bipartisan compromise. Jeanne Shaheen, Senator Shaheen has defended it. And Angus King has said that reimposing the capital requirements, as your bill would do, to roll back that deregulatory move, could push small and medium-sized banks out of business. How do you respond to your fellow Democrats who are not on board with it?
So remember that in 2018, the bill that was passed had a lot of different provisions, including a lot of provisions that lightened some of the regulations, made life easier for the community banks. And there were people who supported the bill because of that. The part I'm concerned about is called Title IV of the bill, and it's Title IV that says these multi-billion-dollar banks, these banks with $50 billion or more in assets, should have lighter regulation. Those are the banks for whom the principal regulator is the Federal Reserve Bank. And those are the banks that took on these risky practices that ultimately have, it appears, blown up at least 3 banks. And that's the provision I want to see peeled back out of the law. We need tough regulations. You got more than $50 billion, then by golly, you ought to be subjected to stress tests and decent capital requirements and so on.
All right, we're just about out of time, but I got to ask you about these comments from Donald Trump calling for protests, saying he's about to be arrested. Are you concerned about the possibility of violence?
Look, violence is never the right answer, and I always worry about it. But this is another case of Donald Trump just trying to advance the interests of Donald Trump, not of the rest of the nation. Let's be clear about what's going on here. No one is above the law, not even the former president of the United States. And if there has been an investigation, and that investigation should be allowed to go forward appropriately, if it's time to bring indictments, then they'll bring indictments. That's how our legal system works. Protests are there's no reason to protest this. This is the law operating as it should, without fear or favor for anyone.
All right, Senator Warren, thank you for joining us this morning.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.